The theme for Little Cities this year is From Whence We Came. And so it's a discussion of the people that came to this region, before. Not just immigrants from the 1800s, but the people that were here as pioneers, the people that were here as natives who also moved to this area. There were a lot more types of people in this region than anybody realizes.
I think it's a really integral part of our story is the immigrant and racial mix of folks who came here to work in the coal mine that still impact who we are today, and really is a provocative and fascinating story from 100 plus years ago. So.
Right from the beginning, they were very, very diverse. And as the decades went on, anywhere between 4, 6, or even 8 different languages could be found or could be heard being spoken in any given community in the region, which is something that nowadays we find almost impossible.
So Appalachia is a region that spans a large portion of the eastern United States. A lot of people can think of Appalachia as a place that's kind of the centrally located part of the region in West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, southeastern Ohio, parts of Virginia and Tennessee. But it actually extends all the way north to New York State and all the way south to Alabama and Mississippi. Migration has been happening in Appalachia since the first humans came here to this area, well before Europeans arrived in the Appalachian region. But when we're thinking about the region as it's been constructed in our modern history, a lot of the immigration stories that we know about are related to the boom and bust of the coal industry.
They always knew the coal was here. They just had to find a way to get to it. So after the Civil War, people started making a serious effort, and there was a huge demand for coal to run factories. The war proved we needed more factories, but that meant that you were going to have to bring in workers, starting with workers to build the railroads. So the Irish and several others, start working to bring the trains in here so that they could ship this coal out.
And before that time, these areas were more sparsely populated, although there were people living in here in this area at the time. But when coal companies came in and wanted to mine the coal, as there was a rising demand for coal as industrialization was developing across the nation, and railroads were built into the region to be able to get access to the coal, they needed more people to come in and be laborers to mine the coal. And so they recruited people from elsewhere to come in and move to the area to do that job.
They were all immigrants from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, also migrants from here in the United States and North America, whether that was European families that had already long been established here for several generations, or African Americans coming up from the South.
And they would pay agents to put posters up. There were bulletin board areas at most train stations and at the ports, and you would say, I want, Corning, Ohio needs workers, or Santoy, good housing, good job waiting for you. In England, there was a man named MacDonald, and he'd started as a pit boy, which means the youngest workers in the mines, and finished up as a member of Parliament, and then started his own union and was organizing people. Alexander MacDonald. He told the workers in Great Britain to go to America, because in Great Britain, if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. By the thousands, men left Great Britain and headed for America because of that campaign. If you look at the early miners' names, particularly the ones that are active in the unions, they're primarily British, because the early immigration pattern was British. We're talking the 1870s, late 1860s, early 1870s. The names that show up are Welsh names, Scottish names, Irish names, and English names. 10 years later, during the Great Strikes, the coal companies started advertising for workers, and they're picking up Hungarians, Czechoslovakians, Bohemians, Germans, There's some Russian. I mean, they're all coming in, and that's because of political problems going on around those countries. And these people start emigrating too.
A lot of Western and Eastern Europeans came to the Appalachian coal camps in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And a lot of African Americans after the Civil War came up for jobs in the coal camps after the Civil War as well. Railroads were built into the region, and coal companies set up areas where workers could come and live there and mine the coal. And so a lot of our communities today got their start during that time of the coal boom.
As they start needing more and more workers, and they find that some of the people here are definitely pro-workers' rights and are starting to resist some of the attempts to control their lives that they see, the companies start advertising more and more overseas, down south, to bring in workers, so that there are so many that if they don't like a particular group of workers, they can just say, let's not hire those guys. Let's fire all of them and get some that'll be more cooperative. I'm not sure they ever found those cooperative groups, but they really tried. The last thing they wanted was for the people that were already here to welcome those people and take them in the Union, which of course is what they attempted to do.
One more that I think is one of my favorites is the Renville story of what really turned out to be an accidental experiment in racial integration in a rural enclave in the late 1800s. And the fact that people from 7 different countries were half the population, and the other half of the population were African Americans who'd been recruited out of the South to come and work in William P. Wren's mine.
You had a community that had a significant African American population that came up here from southern states in around 1880 and the years after, but also you had German immigrants with that. You had Scots-Irish immigrants with that. You know, you had all of this mixture of black and white, European and American in one place. You know, there's a famous story of Uncle Joe, who lived and was a postmaster there for several years in Renville, and he could speak 6 languages. He learned that so he could talk to people and actually help them as the postmaster of the communities.
And it was also a place for folks like Richard L. Davis, the union organizer, to have the freedom to express himself and rise to national ranks in the nation's labor movement. So that's one of my favorite stories. It's probably one of the ones I'm most proud of in terms of our area's contribution.
Most of the people coming in as immigrants were not in the expensive rooms. There was a lot of illness because people were crowded together. Certainly I know that not everybody made it. And then you had to get to the ports and be healthy enough to pass. And then you would have to find a ride to get here. Everybody thinks it's Ellis Island, but there actually were a number of ports up and down the coast from Georgia all the way up to, clear up past Philadelphia. Even in Canada, you will occasionally see where someone came in from Canada, wherever the boat landed. And then you would either look for work there or find your way to the next place you were going. Sometimes there actually are pictures, drawings of agents meeting the immigrants at the port and grabbing them as they come off the boat and going, quick, the train leaves, in an hour from here, let's run, and putting them on the train and sending them straight out before they've even had a chance to, get their bearings a little bit, and they're just off and running. One of my favorite stories about getting here was a family that came into Philadelphia, took a train to Pittsburgh, a regular passenger train, at which point they were put on a flatbed car with benches on it and sent to Corning, where they found that they were strike breakers and were there to replace other workers. And when they found that out, the man went on strike the first day he got here, because he said he wasn't taking another person's job.
One of my favorite ones was told by Glenna Maxwell Palmer from Drake's, and her family had a store in Drake's. And There were a number of Hungarian immigrants who came into Drake's and lived in a particular part of town, because the town kind of was organized by nationalities. And this one gentleman who didn't speak the language and came by himself would always introduce himself as Johnny One People. He was only one person, but I just always loved the ring of that and the thought of it, that his name was Johnny One People all of his life.
A lot of times the men came first and then the families came after. You know, depending on how much money they had, the man might come here, work for a while, and then send back to get the children. You know, so that was a problem. I saw one where they had to leave one of the children behind. She wasn't well enough to make the trip. So they took the other children and left that one behind with the grandparents, and the child did not make it. But they were never able to bury her. I mean, the family took care of it, but they never saw her again. They just didn't think she would survive the trip, and she wouldn't have. So they came without her. So these were tough choices.
I think many of us that will participate in Little Cities Fest this year are descendants of those families. And so the families that have stayed and made their life here certainly have had an impact. And
they brought their culture, they brought their heritage, they brought their religious beliefs, they brought the recipes for food, they brought just their opinion of the way they go about business.
There are families all over this area that are Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, Polish. All those old cultures still have descendants here. And they made up the mix that is the little cities.
Human beings are always on the move in some capacity, and the changes in our world and in society, you know, push people to leave places, pull people to move to other places, and that has a big effect on the character of communities and neighborhoods and people's families, and all of those, you know, social networks that we have in our society.
We are heavily impacted by our ancestors and things that we have learned from our parents or grandparents. And I think it's easy to forget that as we get older, but there are people here that represent their heritage and their ancestry, and that's something that has been passed down to them that they've learned.
We were influenced by what happened during those early years in terms of our resourcefulness, our probably a little bit of distrust for authority because of the union movement, and an appreciation of community, kind of, you know, we're almost too tough to die because our communities, even though they've been ravaged by out-migration and the shrinking economy here, people still try to keep that spirit alive.
There's all these stories of loneliness and settling in and trying to make it work, and not everybody made it work, but a lot of them did, and they're still here.
I think a lot of that came from the closeness that people felt in these little towns during the early years, because in many cases these towns were just populated by strangers from different countries and nationalities, and they figured out ways to build communities.
You can find pieces of the immigration story everywhere you look. You just have to know where to look, and also just keep your mind and your eyes open at all times.
So there's all this history tied up with the people, and we want to talk about everybody and the people that have moved here in the last 20, 30 years. Why did they come? You know, what is it about being here that makes you happy? And what do you bring? You know, what have you brought and what have you gathered? What have you learned from being here? I think if we can just get people to discuss it, even if they don't come to a meeting, even if they just want to look at themselves and say, well, yeah, my family came from this.